Well, good morning. I was just telling Lisa, I don't think I've given a lecture at 8 in the morning for maybe 7, 8 years. I'm usually running around the house, wrestling my kid at 8 in the morning, telling him to drop the butcher knife and put on his shoes and that sort of thing. So I hope you can give me a break. It is really an honor to be here this morning, and I'd like to thank Jennifer and the grad students and the Society for a really kind invitation to talk this morning. I'm going to stick to the script too. My talk will run roughly half an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for any questions or comments that you might have. Okay. In January 2008, Montana Senator Jon Tester requested that the University of Montana's College of Forestry and Conservation initiate an outside and independent assessment of selected issues facing the United States Forest Service. In June 2008, Interim Dean Jim Birchfield and myself presented the senator with that requested analysis and a set of recommendations. So today what I plan on doing is sharing with you an abbreviated version of those recommendations that Jim and I are solely responsible for making. And along the way, I plan on talking about making a few individual observations that I think that might be of some interest to this group. So my plan is to cover a lot of ground very quickly so that we can discuss these issues later on. I have a few different objectives this morning. First, I hope that you will agree with our recommendations made to the senator. Second, I hope to provide some political context for those of you working and studying in the field of conservation biology, to maybe provide a sense of where we're at and where we might be headed in the future. There are also three central themes of our report that I hope you will consider today. The first is the need to reinvest in our federal lands and the agencies responsible for managing them. Another key theme of the report is the need to resolve some old festering conflicts like the roadless area management so that we can collectively focus on a new class of more complicated policy problems. Finally, we emphasize the need for a comprehensive study of national forest law and policy by a very diverse set of interests. I have brought along a few copies of the report that we made to Senator Tester, and there's also a PDF version available at the College of Forestry's website. Be warned, it's only a partial examination of some key issues, and it focuses exclusively on the national forests. So before proceeding with our recommendations, let me just briefly survey the big picture, the policy, legal context, as I see it at least. And again, I am focusing solely on the national forests here, but in many ways the situation is very similar if you're thinking about the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, the BLM. Again, these agencies manage roughly 1/3 of the United States in federal ownership. So their importance to conservation and biodiversity is obviously clear. So first, there remain core differences of opinion as to how the national forests are required and ought to be managed. The executive, Congress, and the judiciary have different answers at different times. Even the courts, including the Ninth Circuit, seem more incoherent and divided than usual these days. These strong disparities of opinion in all three branches of government and by the public at large can have a debilitating effect on the Forest Service, whose personnel also disagree on what purposes should be prioritized for the agency. The open-ended nature of national forest law also leaves the service susceptible to executive-level pendulum swings, with the agency being whipsawed back and forth depending on who controls the White House. The intractable nature of several forest policy conflicts, from the roadless rule saga to the forest planning regulations, can be partly understood in this context as one administration negates the workings of the last. These abrupt changes in policy make it difficult for Forest Service personnel who are responsible for implementing these executive-based initiatives and goals, and leave the agency open to criticism that is without direction and a clear sense of purpose. I say this as well because of how sympathetic Jim and I are to the Forest Service's situation. as finding the public good in a pluralistic democracy is no easy task. Criticism notwithstanding, the Forest Service is at a critical juncture. As we explain in the report, never before has the agency faced so many daunting challenges: global climate change, private land development, fire, water, forest health, recreation. These and other issues pose unprecedented challenges to the agency and to lawmakers. The last 16 years, 8 under President Clinton and 8 under President Bush, seems to have left the agency in a state of suspended animation. Several Clinton-era rules were rewritten by the Bush administration, with many of them then set aside by the courts. And keep in mind, by the way, that these federal courts are now roughly the product of 20 years of Democratic presidential nominees and 20 years of Republican nominees since the Kennedy administration. Widespread confusion and uncertainty is the result. So before launching into additional piecemeal solutions and shallow quick fixes, the next administration will have an excellent opportunity to chart the course for a more vital, confident, and effective Forest Service. We believe that our recommendations, if acted upon by lawmakers in the agency, could move us beyond past conflicts so that we can confront a new class of challenging problems. So with that background, I'd like to present to you our set of policy recommendations made to the Senator. My limited time means that I'm going to just lay them out without a whole lot of detail and reasoning provided. But again, Jim and I are anxious to talk about the report with any of you anytime at all. If you like the report and wish to share your pleasure with it, please give me a call at 243-6795. And if you dislike what we've done and wish to share your thoughts and suggestions, please call Interim Dean Jim Birchfield at 243-5521. So here then are our recommendations that we made to the Senator in June. Number one, lawmakers should reinvest in the protection and management of the national forests and fund the Forest Service at levels commensurate with its responsibilities. Increasing demands are being placed upon the service while it has provided a diminishing budget that goes disproportionately to fighting fire. It often appears to us that the agency is set up to fail because of inadequate funding for particular activities. So let me provide a few quick examples. First, take NEPA and other analytical and planning obligations. As you know, much attention has been placed on the burdens imposed by NEPA and the time it takes to meet this and other statutory mandate. But it is quite unfair to criticize the service for untimely completion of NEPA and planning when the agency doesn't have the adequate resources that could expedite this process. Or take the case of forest restoration. Not all of these projects should have to pay their own way. Currently, in many situations, restoration projects are paid for through the harvesting of timber, often under Stewardship Contracting Authority. While this tool is a positive development, it does not relieve Congress or the executive of their responsibility to reinvest in the national forests and their restoration. Bundling restoration projects having widespread appeal and support with controversial timber sales will perpetuate unnecessary conflict and mire the agency in appeals and lawsuits. Monitoring programs provide another example, and I'm sure this group of conservation biologists know the story well. There's widespread agreement that monitoring is a key component of any adaptive approach to planning and that more of it should be done by federal land agencies. But there is a long history of unfunded monitoring programs, and monitoring-related line items are often the first cut by lawmakers. So I could go on, of course, as the report does, about enforcement funding for newly created travel management plans, the underfunding of private land acquisition programs like the Forest Legacy Program, Land and Water Conservation Fund. But what we do in the report is to simply show what happens when lawmakers underinvest in our federal lands and the agencies responsible for managing them. Number two, there is broad-based national and state-level support for administratively protecting inventoried roadless areas, and these lands should be protected accordingly. The question of how to make the roadless decision is complicated and controversial and fraught with ongoing litigation. Now, I won't torture you with the complicated chronology of the roadless rule. And if I did, this would be the last time a policy person was ever invited to a chapter conference. But just to refresh your memory, recall that Clinton's 2001 roadless rule, administratively protecting 59 million acres, was replaced by the Bush administration state petitions rule that allowed states to petition the federal government for how they would like roadless lands in their states managed. During this time frame, a district court in California found the Bush rule illegal, and then a Wyoming district court found the Clinton rule illegal for the second time. And the process is currently playing out, causing an obvious amount of confusion. But uncertainty aside, let us not lose sight of an important but underreported fact in this story. Almost every state participating in the Bush administration state petitioning process requested roadless area protection. Even Idaho's recent roadless petition is garnering a lot of conservationist support. Montana, as you know, has not submitted a state petition, but its Attorney General filed amicus in favor of the 2001 rule, and Governor Schweitzer clearly recognized the vital role roadless areas play in Montana. So we can discuss the pros and cons of both roadless rulemakings and also speculate about what the 9th and 10th Circuits will do to both rules. But again, let us not lose sight of the fundamental lesson here. Input solicited during these rulemakings make it clear that there is broad-based support from the top down and the bottom up for roadless area protection in Montana and beyond. So when it comes to moving forward, of getting us beyond old, stale, dysfunctional conflicts so that we can confront this new class of problems, this recommendation might be most important of all. Protecting those 59 million acres simply makes good political, financial, and ecological sense. Number 3, the 2008 forest planning regulations fail to find an appropriate balance between adaptability and enforceable standards and should be rewritten by the next presidential administration. Now, before Jim and I lose any more of our friends in the Forest Service, let us be clear that we are very sympathetic with the problems of implementing planning under the 1982 regulations. But the answer to the planning problem is not to relieve the agency of legally binding prescriptions, nor to substitute a meaningful planning process with something that is nothing but strategic and aspirational in nature. So there are several major problems with the 2008 regulations. First, they unnecessarily maximize agency discretion by weakening substantive environmental protection and standards. NIFMA was designed to, the National Forest Management Act, NIFMA, was designed to rein in such discretion by providing clear standards and enforceable checks on the Forest Service. Now, meeting these standards has proven difficult for the agency at times, but the solution is better implementation with requisite institutional support, not the removal of those standards. The regulations also mistakenly exclude forest plans from NEPA. However preliminary, these plans set agencies on a particular path and should be subject to NEPA review. These plans will also lead to an increasing amount of work being pushed to the forest project level. And several of these projects will likely be categorically excluded from NEPA as well. And I recall, for example, the recent GAO study showing that almost 3/4 of vegetative management projects done by the Forest Service in recent years have been categorically excluded from NEPA. So as you can tell, part of our worry here is the agency's implementation and avoidance of NEPA at the planning and project levels. Our national forests face unprecedented challenges and uncertainties in the future. Perhaps at no other time in the agency's history is there a need for the type of precautionary and informed decision-making that NEPA requires. And to be honest, Jim and I don't have the right answer to the planning problem, although Jim thinks he does. But we are convinced that lessons can be learned from these recent rulemakings and that a more acceptable balance can be found between adaptability and meaningful standards. Recommendation number 4. Private land development adjacent to the national forest is an increasing problem that must be aggressively confronted using an assortment of policy approaches and tools. from fully funded land acquisition programs to landscape level planning initiatives. Now, at this point, I could present the evidence to you in terms of Western population growth, subdivision, forest fragmentation, etc. But I trust that you are depressingly familiar with those figures and what it means in terms of fire management, wildlife, infrastructure costs. So undoubtedly, the value of the national forests and federal lands in general will increase, both politically and ecologically, as more private lands get developed. And there are numerous ways in which we can tackle these problems, an entire toolbox of conservation strategies that can be synergistically deployed in the future. But for purposes here, consider how the Forest Service could respond or not respond to the private land problem. As a start, we urge the service to address private land development in its forest planning process. Give the public a sense of the big picture of what has happened and is happening on these adjacent national forests and what it means for national forest management and biodiversity. There is, in fact, ample historical precedent for the Forest Service to consider what is happening on adjacent private lands and to respond accordingly on federal lands. And if the agency fails to consider the larger landscape when making decisions, we should expect a growing number of interests to legally challenge the agency using laws like the Endangered Species Act and NEPA's cumulative effects analysis requirement, among others. So the agency should carefully consider what is happening on adjacent private lands and make corresponding adjustments on the national forests. Put differently, when ecosystem goods and services found on private lands are diminished, there is a more prominent need to compensate for such losses on federal lands. Number 5. The fifth recommendation is in response to the steady beating environmental law and regulation have taken over the last 8 years in public discourse and by our political institutions. Of course, there are other ways of advancing conservation objectives, but the rule of law and the necessity of environmental regulation must be appreciated. First of all, it is important to recognize the cumulative nature of federal land and environmental law. Previous Congresses meant to protect our federal lands and the environment by providing legally binding substantive standards and more commonly procedural obligations. Environmental protection through extensive analysis and procedure to require that agencies look before they leap, in other words, is by congressional design. It's also clear that the enforcement of environmental law plays a significant role in forest management and often facilitates and leverages the use of less adversarial conservation strategies, from land acquisition to collaboration to adaptive management. So take adaptive management, for example. It's obviously hard to be against it. I'm certainly not in favor of static mismanagement. But the approach needs environmental law and regulation to truly flourish, or to have any purpose at all. Not only will environmental standards provide the goals and objectives of an experimentation, but they can ensure that adaptive management and monitoring is taken seriously by the agency and not just used for political cover and a way of making politically risky decisions. So if lawmakers weaken or undermine these legal standards, other approaches to conservation will also be impacted. Obviously, finding efficiencies in the decision-making process should be encouraged, but the Forest Service should not view their legal obligations as inconvenient procedural hurdles that must be overcome, but rather a set of precautionary tools that lead to more inclusive and environmentally sound decision. These laws should be viewed as goals, not constraints. The report also briefly discusses the emergence of place-based or forest-specific legislative proposals, several of which are being debated here in Montana, such as the Beaverhead Deer Lodge Partnership and the Blackfoot Clearwater proposal, among others. There are significant variations to this approach in terms of their substance and process, but they generally combine wilderness recommendation, restoration objectives, and various methods to secure a more steady stream of timber to local sawmills, among other provisions that are wrapped into a legislative package to be considered by Congress. We believe that questions about funding, precedent, planning, and others deserve careful study and full deliberation before these approaches are replicated more broadly. To be candid, Jim and I disagree about the potential benefits and problems of this place-based legislated approach. I am much more sympathetic to the approach than our misguided interim dean. But we both want to proceed cautiously down this track because we are convinced that passage of these laws will possibly open the floodgates to others, and some of those proposals might not be in the public's interest. There are also tough questions that must be answered before the legislative sausage making ensues. Consider, for example, how these place-based laws, if they do go national in scope, are going to be appropriated. Where is this money going to come from? Other national forests, other regions, from states with less powerful or less senior congressional delegations? Or consider how these legislative packages are going to fit or not fit into existing forest planning processes, or how much room they leave for adaptation and change down the road. Now, I personally don't think these questions cannot be answered. We just hope that we don't rush into what is really a systematic change in how we govern the national forests without careful study and deliberation. Our final recommendation focuses on the need for a systematic review of national forest law and policy. Significant changes have happened since the National Forest Management Act was passed in 1976. And the problems and opportunities evident in forest management require a comprehensive assessment by an inclusive set of interests and perspectives. This is by far our most developed and important recommendation. We believe that a broadly scoped, rigorous look at forest law and policy is desperately needed. Conservationists, industry, native nations, academics, practitioners, and others have to be involved in finding more durable solutions to a complicated set of problems. And we have designed a project to do just that. And we hope that if you agree with us, that you will help us advance that proposal. So there are four major reasons why we recommend and are currently pushing for this comprehensive and well-represented examination of forest law. Number one, more than 30 years have passed since NIFMA was enacted in 1976. New laws, planning processes, court decisions, executive orders, the field of conservation biology, new science, technology, fires, population growth, private land development, economic transition, the collaborative movement, motorized recreation, international trade deals, among a lot of other significant developments, are but a few reasons why it is time to revisit our national forest law and policy. The best way to think about this, in my opinion, is to consider the Bitterroot National Forest in our own backyard. As most of you know, the Bitterroot was one of the two sparks that basically initiated national change, and basically with passage of NIFMA in 1976. And just consider how much has changed on the Bitterroot since 1976. Number two, a comprehensive and careful assessment is preferable to an executive-dominated shotgun approach or predetermined congressional committee studies or task forces that will be immediately questioned by opposing parties. A comprehensive approach might also help us avoid unintended consequences that could result from a more partisan tinkering. Number three, we suspect that many of the problems facing the Forest Service do not originate in one single law or regulation, but rather from their cumulative nature. A comprehensive assessment will help us untangle this knot of laws and policies and examine how they fit and often fail to fit together. The study might conclude, for example, that a scalpel is a better tool to use than a sledgehammer when it comes to fixing forest law and policy. Or perhaps that is the implementation of such laws that is the real problem here. But the point really is to simply ask the question and try to answer it in a serious fashion. Number four, a comprehensive assessment will generate constructive dialogue and analysis among a broad cross-section of interests. It might actually uncover some common ground among various actors. If not, at least it will crystallize some of the core differences of opinion and force interest to speak with more vision and clarity about where they want us to go and why. So all that said, I'm sure that some of you are still skeptical or perhaps concerned that such an endeavor might be a clever way of reworking legislation that simply impedes economic development on the federal lands. And we're not naive, and we understand that some interests will join the effort trying to advance that type of agenda. On the other hand, please consider the option of doing nothing or pretending that the status quo is the best that we can do. We believe that simply maintaining the status quo is insufficient. Consider various energy development scenarios that we've been hearing about over the last few months, motorized recreation, rampant private land development, and what are becoming annual funding crises. There are certainly risks of asking some questions, but from our standpoint, they are worth it. So as you can likely tell, our report is based on some core values and beliefs. Most importantly, we are unwavering in our support of federal lands and the national forests. Our federal lands heritage provides a wealth of benefits that should be celebrated, safeguarded, and managed for the public's interests. Reinvestment is the key word of this report, and we sincerely hope that the next administration, the next Congress, and Montana's congressional delegation embrace this responsibility. Thank you. I have a lot of time for questions and comments. Yeah.
If you could just repeat the question for the camera. Just repeat the question.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. See, 8 o'clock in the morning, see? God, this is going to be hard. Pete, I don't know if we should start with you, but we're going.
Well, I'll ask it maybe easy one and then add on to it. But I'm interested, it's pretty recent since you released the report. I'm wondering whether you've had any early response to it. And then the other thing that comes to mind, and I don't know whether to what extent you've mulled it over, is just your first recommendation about solving the whole NEPA issue with additional resources and better implementation. I'm just wondering about, you know, the agency has been working in this one mode for so long of kind of dealing with the NEPA, how long, you know, it's kind of feeling like it takes a long time, and what are the solutions. I'm just wondering what type of, if all of a sudden there was more funding for better implementation, what type of cultural change, how long would it take for the agency to kind of switch gear, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if I have an answer to that question, but you know, we are sympathetic with the agency being criticized by all sides for how long it takes to meet their planning and analytical obligations when they don't have the sufficient funds necessary to expedite the NEPA process. And so I think it is unfair. I'm obviously a NEPA nut. I believe in the very values of NEPA in a very serious way. And it leads to that sort of precautionary informed decision-making and public participation, et cetera. But Congress has laid on so many statutory mandates on the agency and simply not allowing them to meet those statutory obligations. So we are sympathetic with the agency's situation in that regard. And we think that we're not saying just throw money at the agency, but we can target certain funds to expedite those processes. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I just, you know, I'm sort of studying organizational culture right now, and I just think there would be kind of a cultural shift that would probably need to, that probably would come with additional financial support.
Well, there was one sentence of that report that, you know, I try to emphasize, and that is that the core shift, I think, not only among the Forest Service but other agencies, is that those environmental laws should be viewed as goals and not constraints. And I think that that is one way that agencies have foundered in the past.
Martin, could you give us a little more detail on your concerns? And it sounds like there's a little tension between you and Jim on the place-based, if you will, experiment that's going on. So could you maybe give us a little more detail on that?
Yeah. Well, we did find something to agree with, actually. it's a system, first of all, I don't want to bore you with the details, but this is, the National Forest System, like the BLM, is a rather has a rather unified mandate compared to other federal land systems, right? So when you're in the Lolo National Forest or in the Flathead, you basically get a sense that this place is going to be managed for multiple use, sustained yield, et cetera, right? That is not the case with the national parks and the national wildlife refuges. So for some of you that might not be familiar with this, the national parks and the refuges are managed under two different mandates. They're organic acts, right, or statutes, and then also very site-specific or place-based enabling statutes that basically tell a refuge of how that place is going to be managed or how this park is going to be managed. So they have dual mandates. So what we're really doing here in the Beaverhead Deer Lodge and in other experiments throughout the West are starting to go down that path, right? And trying to legislate some of these agreements. I, for one, don't have, as a process matter, I'm not talking about the substance of the Beaverhead Deer Lodge or the Blackfoot Clearwater, but in terms of a governance approach, I'm okay with that, right? I think that what you find among all different interests right now is the need for some certainty and some predictability on the federal lands. And people are not willing to, don't want to grant the Forest Service maximum discretion to make these decisions. They want some certainty and feel that the only way to get that certainty is through an act of Congress. And I'm sympathetic with that. And I think most of the issues that bog down national forest management are basic political questions, allocation questions, and that can be handled legislatively. I just want to make sure that we go about it in a smart way and really make sure that we ask those tough questions before it goes to Washington, not after the fact. And to take some time and learn some lessons. And this is why I think Jim is so skeptical of the approach, because we've had a few instances, like the Quincy Library Group, for example, that have been failures for various reasons. And I understand that. So we're kind of right now going through some of those files and trying to pull additional lessons from all of this place-based legislation. And I think, from a value standpoint, Jim believes in the agency and believes that those line officers can do a good job and feels much more trustful than I am of giving the agency some discretion. I, on the other hand, we've talked about some of this before. I'm not the most trustful person in the world, and I don't mind. I think that the agency does best when it's given a clear direction and sense of purpose. And I think it'll get the Forest Service off the hook. Right? They'll be told what to do and how to do it, and I don't think that's a bad thing.
But we have to trust Congress to do that.
Yeah, and no comment. Todd, yeah.
I guess I'd like to follow up on that trusting Congress notion. What your proposal or your recommendations seem to have a heavy reliance on congressional action, both in terms of the funding issue and rewriting legislation or changing legislation. How likely do you see this as happening? And then kind of, given the risk aversion, the political trade-offs, the very, very narrow margins of majority in Congress, and then how realistic is it to trust Congress to do that? Or to get it right or even get it better than it currently is?
Well, all the chips are up in the air right now, obviously. So come November, it could be a very different world that we live in. And I think it's safe to say that federal lands are not going to be at the top of anyone's priority list for the first year or so. But when you consider global climate change, and we're going to see a bill there somehow under either administration, the federal lands have to play a role in that legislation, obviously. So that provides one vehicle for some sort of change. And when we think about energy development, which I think is at the top of everyone's agenda, federal lands are going to play a role in that regard as well. when Jim and I sat down and hammered out these recommendations, we tried to be real thoughtful and give a set of recommendations that we felt the senator was uniquely positioned to act on, or to at least question, you know. So we did it that way. And we're still pushing for the comprehensive report because we are convinced that what we've seen over the last 8 years has not been a real honest attempt to figure out these problems at all. You know, we've had multiple task forces investigating the problems of the Endangered Species Act, of NEPA. And again, they have been immediately questioned by opposing parties as, you know, greenwashed covers, basically. And no one has taken those very seriously at all. And what we don't want to do is have the same sort of thing. What Jim and I would like to do is have a more serious assessment. I mean, bring everybody to the table, real policy professionals and practitioners, and try to find out where there's some common ground and where there's some agreement. And I don't know how we would package that at the end, but maybe we could somehow find a core set of recommendations that are embraced by multiple actors and see what Congress does with that. You know, we've received some interest, but the idea of a comprehensive study is politically risky in a lot of different ways. And so what we've really noticed is some, you know, a healthy skepticism and some reluctance to even talk about legislative change. But again, I mean, from our standpoint, we believe that the status quo, it does not work, you know, and that we have to talk legislatively. And that's been one of the big problems with national forest policy reform in the past, that, you know, various committees, like the Committee of Scientists that convened in 2000, for example, their charter was to simply look at forest regulations and not forest laws. And we think that you have to consider that larger legislative context as well. So I don't know. You know, I'm not a politician. We have a senator that asked us to provide a set of recommendations and our take on things, and we provided it. And at this point, I don't know.
I'm interested to hear, you've used the word governance a lot. I'm interested to hear how you define that. And then how you bring that definition into the context of the report within the context of the public interest. And how then that translates, although you were not very explicit about it, but you were seeming to infer a difference between the executive branch at the elected level, at the appointed level, and at the career professional level. Those are not interchangeable, obviously, at the policy level in this whiplash pendulum swing that you mentioned.
I knew I should have never called on you. Well, I use the word governance in a very loose way. I often think about political institutions and decision-making processes. And I would put in all sorts of venues under that framework in terms of litigation, the appeals process, planning, science, down the line. You know, how we're making some of those decisions. And what I would argue, and what I argue in my recent book, is that Congress has basically not answered some of the core questions about federal lands management, right? I mean, the incredibly vague term multiple use, for example, can be interpreted in very different ways. I mean, it has been used to defend setting aside 59 million acres as roadless. And it's been used to defend an 8.7 billion board foot timber sale on the Tongass National Forest, both upheld as legitimate constructions of multiple use. So Congress has not answered the central questions about federal lands management. So what has happened from a governance standpoint are all of those core questions have been pushed into alternative venues. As you know very well, we end up debating wolf issues, for example, through competing science, for example, through the courts, through the appeals process, through forest planning processes. All of these venues have basically become de facto forums for conflict resolution, and they weren't designed to do that. Right? At their core, I believe that these are legislative questions that have to be addressed by Congress, or we're going to continue down this, this path of never-ending argument. As far as the splits within the agency, I think, and again, focusing on the Forest Service, it's absolutely clear. If you look at some of the GAO studies that have been put out over the last 10 years, that there are serious differences of opinion in Forest Service personnel. So there's no common agreement even with the agency of what uses and values should be prioritized. And then when you consider political appointees and the role that they play, and that's modern democracy at work. It's messy. I don't have any, we didn't address that issue. Yeah.
Returning to the place-based initiatives, I'm curious just about some of the accountability issues, if there is any recommendations there. And I guess I'm thinking in terms of who sits at the table to make these. I think there's often questions of who are making these decisions for public lands, and are they accountable decisions if we're going to, in fact, support these sort of initiatives?
Yeah, these are some really big questions. And, we can talk about some of these. I wouldn't talk about the Beaverhead Deer Lodge or some of these other partnerships as being necessarily models of collaboration. I'm inherently mistrustful of that. I see it, as a political scientist, I see this as interest group negotiation, and I'm fine with that. That's what it is. So we can call it collaboration. I don't care. It's different interest groups hammering out their ideas. And so you have these very difficult questions of who's at the table, who's not invited. From a political science standpoint, you could argue that, well, that proposal is going to be considered by Congress, and then you have the public participation process there. And you can start putting weight on your congressional delegation or whatever. So there's some transparency that way. What Jim and I would like to see is give some real thought about how we might embed some of these place-based approaches in a larger decision-making process. Provide additional layers of legitimacy. For example, how to possibly utilize this place-based approach while also putting it in the forest planning process and NEPA, for example. And those are really tough questions, and that's really what's bogged down the Quincy Library Group, is that they've never really quite figured out how to implement the Quincy the legislation and put it in the Sierra Nevada framework. And that's basically where we're at right now. That's why it's been a failure, basically. So there's some of those really big questions out there. I had another thought. Did I answer your question?
Any recommendations, though, in terms of how to do that?
Not at this point. And one of our fears, of course, is that we need to be thoughtful before proceeding down this pathway, because what happens if we start passing place-based legislation here in Montana, and we have other Western congressional delegations vote in favor of those place-based initiatives, and we start seeing more questionable initiatives come from some places like Wyoming or Idaho, for example, and we have started to collect some of those proposals that have been made in recent years, and some of them I find incredibly objectionable. Right? They're place-based bills that fully exempt NEPA, that put advisory, underrepresented advisory committees in charge of certain things. So that's why we're concerned about the precedent that this could set. Because does that mean if folks are going to vote for these Montana place-based bills, does that mean that therefore Montana's delegation is responsible for voting for some of these others that might not be in the public's interest? I mean, you have to give me, questions about democratic accountability and governance, this is not 8:30 material, so. Okay, that's right.
You bring up this Beaverhead Deer Lodge and the Blackbird Deer. Anyway, deciding how the national forest should be managed. And they have, what I object to is they have no political background. They don't support the will of support their own particular point of view. And I'd rather myself rely on the Forest Service and their expertise to make these kinds of decisions on how these various pieces of land should be managed, rather than say we're going to bounce the timber interest off the road interests. And I think that to me is too much special interest, a lot of other interests in between the Forest Service is taking into account.
Well, let me just make sure I'm clear that I am not opposed, we are not opposed to those place-based bills. We're simply saying that we would like some questions answered before they're replicated on a broader scale. And again, I'm obviously more sympathetic, and one of the reasons is I think that it does show a group of interests trying to figure out how to move forward, of actually saying that this is what success on the ground looks like, and thinking broadly, and thinking more broadly than just wilderness designation, but also restoration and other objectives. And I think that is very admirable. And I think we need more of that sort of honest dialogue about what we want these landscapes to actually look like, and ask some of these big questions. Now, we could talk about all of the details and who wasn't at the table and how it doesn't jive with the planning, the Beaver Head Deer Lodge plan and all of that, and that would be fun to do. But when it comes down to it, I guess I do have a lot of admiration for a group of interests trying to figure out what success on the ground looks like, right? Instead of just reacting to problems to actually try to get us to that next point. Now, that's myself. I'm not sure if Jim would agree with that. Our interim dean, Jim Birchfield, yeah, my co-author of this report.
I think we're actually going to have to stop the questions now and take a break. We have a 10-minute break, but join me in thanking Martin for a great discussion.
Thank you.